Two of the world's most influential scriptures. Two very different claims about how they've survived across the centuries. Today we're asking a question that sits at the center of countless theological debates. Which is better preserved, the Bible or the Quran? Joining us, an Islamic scholar and Quranic studies expert, and a Christian biblical scholar and textual critic. Each will present their case using manuscripts, historical scholarship, and textual evidence. Here's the format: 2 minutes each for opening statements. Then cross-examination, 3 questions each, timed at 3 minutes per response. A 2-minute rebuttal round follows. And finally, 5 minutes each for closing statements. No winner will be declared today, just 2 rigorous cases for you to weigh.
Round 1, Opening Statements. Thank you. The Quran's preservation claim rests on a distinctive dual transmission system, written manuscript alongside continuous, unbroken oral memorization. From the very beginning, Muslims memorized the Quran in its entirety, a practice called Hifz, producing generation after generation of Hafiz, individuals who can recite all 6,236 verses from memory, cross-checked constantly against both other memorizers and the written text. This isn't a historical footnote, it's a living tradition practiced by millions today. On the written side, the Quran was compiled into a single standardized text under the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, within roughly 2 decades of Muhammad's death, and distributed to major Islamic centers, with competing versions reportedly destroyed to prevent textual divergence. Early manuscripts support an ancient, stable text. The Sanaa Palimpsest, discovered in Yemen, contains an underlying text radiocarbon dated to within decades of the traditional revelation period, and the Birmingham Quran manuscript fragment has returned radiocarbon dating, placing it in a similarly early window. I'll also raise something often overlooked: the Qira'at. The 7 to 10 canonically accepted reading traditions represent recognized minor variations in pronunciation and dialect explicitly traced back to Muhammad's own companions, not later corruption, but a documented, sanctioned diversity within a stable consonantal framework. Between the memorization system and this manuscript record, Islamic scholarship argues the Quran represents an exceptionally well-preserved ancient text.
Thank you. The Bible's preservation case rests on an entirely different foundation, not a single controlled transmission line, but an enormous, independently verifiable manuscript tradition allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the earliest recoverable text with remarkable confidence. We possess over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, plus tens of thousands more in Latin, Coptic, and other ancient languages. The largest body of ancient manuscript evidence for any text from the ancient world. Next to nothing else in antiquity comes close. Some fragments, like the John Rylands Papyrus, p. 52, date to within decades of the original composition. For the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered starting in 1947, include a complete Isaiah scroll dating to roughly the 2nd century BCE, over 1,000 years older than previously available Hebrew manuscripts. And it matches the medieval Masoretic text with remarkable, though not perfect, consistency, demonstrating serious textual stability across an enormous time span. The key methodological point is this: because we have so many independent manuscripts, copied in different regions by different scribal communities, textual critics can compare them against each other to identify where and how variants crept in over time. A rigorous, transparent, falsifiable methodology called textual criticism. Yes, there are textual variants between manuscripts, hundreds of thousands across the whole manuscript tradition, counting every spelling difference. But scholars broadly agree the overwhelming majority are trivial, and modern critical editions, like the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, reconstructed text scholars are highly confident approximates the earliest recoverable readings.
Round 2, Cross-examination.
The Uthmanic codification process, by the traditional Islamic account, involved standardizing the text and destroying competing versions. Doesn't the deliberate destruction of variant manuscripts make independent textual verification, the same method used for the Bible, essentially impossible, since we can't cross-check the standardized text against genuinely independent early witnesses that survived unaltered?
This is a fair methodological point, and I want to answer it precisely rather than dismiss it. It's true the Uthmanic process reduced textual multiplicity by design, but destroyed doesn't mean unverifiable. We do have surviving early manuscripts predating and contemporary with this standardization, like the Sanaa Palimpsest, whose lower text, a version that was later effectively erased and overwritten, shows variant reading. Scholars like Behnam Sadeghi have studied in detail, finding differences that are largely in word order, spelling, and minor phrasing rather than substantive content or theology. This actually gives us exactly the kind of independent check you're describing, a pre-Uthmanic textual layer we can compare against the standardized consonantal skeleton, and the comparison shows a remarkably stable core text, not wholesale divergence. I'd agree the Quran's manuscript tradition doesn't offer the sheer volume of independent witnesses the New Testament does. That's a genuine structural difference between the two traditions' preservation models, not a weakness I'll pretend doesn't exist. But fewer independent early witnesses isn't the same as no way to verify, and what we do have supports the traditional stability claim. With over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts come, by scholarly counts including those of Bart Ehrman, several 100,000 textual variants across the whole tradition, more variants, famously, than there are words in the New Testament. Doesn't this sheer volume of manuscript disagreement undermine confidence that we can reliably reconstruct the original text at all, compared to a tradition built on continuous, controlled memorization?
This is the objection most people raise, and the raw number, while accurate, is genuinely misleading without context. I'll explain why. The reason we have so many variants is precisely because we have so many manuscripts. Every manuscript that differs from another by even a single letter or spelling counts as a variant. So more manuscripts mechanically produces more counted variants, even though it also means more cross-checking power, not less. Textual scholars, including Ehrman himself despite his skeptical popular reputation, and evangelical scholars like Daniel Wallace who directly debate him, broadly agree that the overwhelming majority of these variants are things like spelling differences, word order swaps that don't change meaning in Greek's flexible grammar, and obvious scribal slips immediately correctable by comparison with other manuscripts. Scholars estimate meaningful, viable variants that could actually affect translation or interpretation are a small fraction of the total, well under 1%, and none affect any core Christian doctrine, a point Ehrman himself has acknowledged even while emphasizing the interesting existence of these variants for other reasons. The volume of manuscripts is a strength for reconstruction, not a liability, precisely because it lets textual critics triangulate the earliest recoverable readings with a transparency a single controlled tradition can't offer in the same way. The Qira'at, the accepted variant reading traditions, do include differences beyond pronunciation in some cases, including occasional differences in word choice and grammatical form that some Western academic scholars argue reflect genuine early textual diversity rather than uniformly sanctioned dialectal variation traceable directly to Muhammad. How does Islamic scholarship respond to that academic characterization?
I think it's important to be precise about what's actually being claimed here, because beyond pronunciation covers a wide range, and conflating small categories can overstate the case. The vast majority of differences among the canonical Qira'at are phonetic and dialectal, how a word is vocalized, since the earliest Arabic script lacked vowel markings and some diacritical dots, meaning a single consonantal skeleton could, in a small number of cases, support more than one legitimate reading. Classical Islamic scholarship has always acknowledged and systematically documented this, going back to scholars like Ibn Mujahid in the 10th century, who formally canonized 7 reading traditions specifically because they were each independently, reliably transmitted with continuous chains back to companions of Muhammad. This isn't a modern apologetic gloss. It's the traditional Islamic scholarly framework itself openly cataloging the variation rather than hiding it. I'd concede that some Western academic scholars, examining this from outside the traditional framework, read a small number of these differences as evidence of a somewhat more fluid early textual situation than the fully standardized popular narrative suggests. That's a genuine, ongoing academic conversation, and I don't think Islamic scholarship is well served by pretending it doesn't exist. But the differences under discussion remain, even by critical academic accounts, minor compared to the consonantal core, not competing versions of the Quran's content or theology. Round 3, Rebuttals. I want to focus on the strongest point raised today, that the sheer manuscript volume behind the New Testament allows a kind of transparent, cross-checkable reconstruction the Quran's more controlled transmission model doesn't offer in the same way. I think that's a fair, honest structural difference between our two traditions, and I won't pretend otherwise. Where I'd push back is on treating volume of variance as automatically a stronger preservation model than continuous, verified memorization. The Quran's Hifz tradition provides something manuscripts alone cannot: a living, constantly cross-checked oral record, verified in real time across every generation by thousands of independent memorizers simultaneously, not solely reconstructed centuries later from surviving physical fragments. Both models have real strengths. Mine emphasizes redundant, continuous, real-time verification. The Christian model emphasizes wide manuscript triangulation after the fact.
I appreciated the honesty regarding the Sanaa Palimpsest and the academic conversation around Qira'at diversity. That kind of candor is exactly what serious textual scholarship on either tradition requires. I'd push back gently on one point. Oral memorization, however impressive and rigorously maintained, is still fundamentally dependent on the written text it's checked against. If the written standard itself was narrowed early through the Uthmanic process, then subsequent memorization, however accurate to that standardized text, isn't independent verification of what preceded it in the same way an untouched, physically surviving earlier manuscript would be. That's the core methodological distinction I'd want viewers to sit with. Verification of internal consistency after standardization isn't quite the same evidential category as independent, external cross-checking against unaltered earlier witnesses, though I recognize, as discussed, some such earlier witnesses do exist for the Quran too, just fewer in number than for the New Testament.
Round 4, Final Statements. Let me draw together what I think today's exchange has shown clearly. Both scriptural traditions have developed serious, sophisticated systems for preserving their texts across many centuries, and both systems have real, honestly acknowledged limitations worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. The Quran's preservation model rests on two mutually reinforcing pillars: an unbroken, living oral memorization tradition, verified constantly and redundantly across generations of Hafiz, and a written manuscript record that, while narrowed through the Uthmanic standardization, is supported by surviving early witnesses, the Sanaa Palimpsest and the Birmingham fragment among them, that corroborate a stable core text from a very early period. The canonically documented Qira'at traditions, rather than being evidence of corruption, represent Islamic scholarship's own transparent, centuries-old cataloging of legitimate variation within that stable framework. I've tried today to engage honestly with the strongest challenges to this picture: the reality that Uthmanic standardization did reduce manuscript diversity by design, and that some academic scholars read early textual evidence as reflecting slightly more fluidity than the fully polished traditional narrative suggests. I don't think acknowledging those points weakens the overall case. I think pretending they don't exist would weaken it far more, by leaving Islamic scholarship's claims looking more fragile under scrutiny than they actually are. What I'd ask viewers to weigh is this: is a living, continuously cross-verified oral tradition, checked in real time by millions of people across 14 centuries, alongside supporting early manuscript evidence, a weaker preservation model than one relying primarily on comparing surviving physical fragments centuries after the fact? I don't think the answer is obviously yes, simply because one tradition has more surviving paper. Different preservation strategies can each provide strong, if differently structured, historical confidence, and I'd invite you to examine the specific manuscript and oral evidence for yourself, rather than accepting either tradition's summary claim about itself without scrutiny.
I'd echo that spirit of mutual respect. Today's conversation showed real methodological differences between two thoughtful, historically grounded approaches to an ancient and difficult problem. How do you know a sacred text today resembles what was first transmitted centuries or millennia ago? The Bible's preservation case rests on the sheer scale and independence of its manuscript witness. Thousands of Greek New Testament manuscripts and Dead Sea Scroll fragments predating other available Hebrew witnesses by over a millennium, distributed across different regions, scribal communities, and time periods. allowing textual critics to triangulate backward toward the earliest recoverable readings using a transparent, falsifiable comparative method. Yes, this produces a large raw count of textual variants, but as I argued, that's a function of abundant evidence, not internal instability, and the overwhelming majority of those variants are trivial spelling and word order differences that don't touch meaning or doctrine, a conclusion textual critics across the confessional spectrum, skeptical and believing alike, broadly share. I want to be fair to what I heard today, though. The Quran's Hifz system is a genuinely remarkable, distinctive preservation mechanism without a real parallel in the Christian manuscript tradition, and the existence of early corroborating manuscripts like the Sanaa Palimpsest is a real, serious piece of evidence I don't think should be dismissed. My core methodological concern remains the one I raised in rebuttal. Verification through a living tradition checked against an already standardized written text is a different evidential category than independent cross-checking against multiple, geographically dispersed, unaltered early manuscripts. Not necessarily weaker in outcome, but resting on a different kind of evidential foundation. And I think that distinction matters for anyone trying to evaluate these claims rigorously rather than take either tradition's account of itself at face value. I'd ask viewers to hold both of these preservation stories up against the actual primary evidence, the manuscripts, the historical record, the documented scholarly debates on both sides, rather than either tradition's confident retelling of its own reliability. That comparative, evidence-first approach is, I think, what serious textual scholarship of any sacred text ultimately requires.
Today, we explored two different approaches to preservation. One emphasizes continuous oral and written transmission, the other emphasizes manuscript comparison and historical reconstruction. The evidence, arguments, and conclusions are now presented before you. The question remains, which preservation method provides the strongest historical case? You decide.